Welcome to this CEN conference on how the UK can compete in a net zero age. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to those of you who are listening online, and thank you to our sponsors as well, EEIG and SSE, who've made this event possible. My name's Sam Hall. I'm the director of CEN. CEN, for those of you who don't know, is the independent forum for conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. Before turning to the reasons why we're hosting this conference, I want to say a few words briefly on format because it's changed a little in the last few days. So apologies that we've had to slightly reorder the programme. This is because the government has announced a running three-line whip later this afternoon and MPs have to be back on the parliamentary estate for then. So as a result, we're delighted the Minister will now open our conference rather than close it with his keynote speech. And I think he's got time for some questions as well, so please be thinking of those as he's speaking. We'll then have our first panel session on why Conservatives should lead on net zero for an hour at 2:30. Then we have a 15-minute break. Apologies that that's a shorter break than advertised. This is so we don't lose Simon Clark from the last panel, which now will start at 3:45 p.m. and on the topic of how Conservatives can deliver net zero. And then the conference will wrap up just before 5 p.m. and then we head over to the Barley Mow pub for a drinks reception. And we've got Matt Hancock as the speaker for that, and that will start at 5:30. Please do post about the conference on social media, on Twitter. I think our hashtag is there. It's at @CEN_HQ and use the hashtag NetZeroAge. And briefly on fire exit instructions, it's back out the way you came, so through that door and out there, but we're not expecting anything in the way of fire drills. So this conference is part of our climate programme at CEN, and I'd like to also pay tribute to Lindsay Jones and Jack Richardson, who've done a brilliant job in organising this. They're going to be chairing the two panel sessions later, so thank you for them for putting this conference on. Our climate programme at CEN is focused on debating and championing market-based solutions to climate change, working with our caucus of over 140 MPs and peers on our network of over 500 Conservative councillors. We've played a key role in securing climate policy changes, including mandating EV charge points in new builds, eliminating VAT from energy efficiency measures, and raising the target for floating offshore wind. But the aim of this conference is to bring together Conservative voices from across the Conservative movement to discuss the most effective messages and policies for decarbonising the economy while maintaining fiscal responsibility and growing the economy. Political support for net zero has remained remarkably resilient over the past year, despite all the political events. We've seen two changes in Conservative Party leader, an energy security crisis and surging cost of living, but yet the UK's climate goals have remained unchanged. In fact, ministers like Graham have been hard at work on delivering them, restarting the energy bills passage through Parliament, unblocking onshore wind in England, expediting nationally significant infrastructure projects, including offshore wind farms, and creating a new energy efficiency task force. But there are some major challenges looming into view which we think will frame today's conference. Firstly, the government faces pressure from the Labour Party to push to invest more public money in the green transition. Labour are pledging to borrow an additional £28 billion a year for the net zero transition. The Conservatives need a strong counter-proposition to demonstrate that a more market-based approach will deliver rapid emissions cuts without pushing up borrowing. Going into the next election, the Conservatives have a strong record to talk about on emissions reduction and on clean energy deployment. But elections are about the future, not the past. So on its own, this past record is unlikely to be sufficient to win the argument that the Conservatives are best placed to tackle climate change. This issue we know matters to voters. They continue to put the environment and climate change as the top 5 issue facing the UK in opinion polls. So we know that the party needs a compelling platform going into the next election on climate. Secondly, there's an active debate within the Conservative Party about the best way to promote and approach net zero. Some favour a more interventionist approach that targets green subsidies at factories in industrial heartlands to maximise the opportunities for job creation and investment in the green transition. Others champion a more free market approach that uses tax breaks and planning liberalisation to reach net zero at the lowest cost. And of course, net zero is just one policy area where this ideological debate is playing out within the Conservative movement. Finally, there's the international competitiveness challenge. The USA's Inflation Reduction Act has fired the starting gun on a green subsidy arms race, and with the EU set to follow suit, the UK's head start in sectors like offshore wind may be at risk. Even if we wanted to, the UK wouldn't be able to match the scale of the Americans' green stimulus. But some kind of response is necessary if we're to secure green investments that are important for maintaining support for net zero, the net zero transition, particularly in our industrial heartlands. So we hope this conference, not at all unambitious, can generate the arguments and ideas for how Conservatives can tackle some of these challenges, particularly with the government's upcoming response to Chris Skidmore's independent review of net zero coming soon. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Graham Stuart. Graham is the Minister of State of the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, having previously served as Energy and Climate Change Minister in BEIS from September 2022, and he's been the Member of Parliament for Beverley and Holderness since 2005. His other previous ministerial roles include Minister of State at the FCDO, Minister for Exports and Minister for Investment at DIT, and an Assistant Government Whip. And it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Graham today, as I started my career in politics working as his parliamentary researcher in Westminster, where he first sparked my interest in climate change policy and in the essential importance of clean technology cost curves, which is one lesson that I always remember. In his office, I saw firsthand Graham's passion for climate change, which he's demonstrated throughout his career in Parliament. He served on the Bill Committee for the Climate Change Act and was on the Environmental Audit Committee. He chaired GLOBE, a global network of legislators committing to climate action, and was the first Conservative MP to call for a net zero target after the signing of the Paris Agreement. So I'm delighted to invite Graham to give his keynote speech today, and there'll be an opportunity for questions afterwards. Graham.
Well, thank you, Sam, and good afternoon, everybody. A lot of my job these days is about generation and about connection. And so it's a particular delight that Sam, who worked in my office, is now the director of SEN, that Simon Clarke, who worked for me for 4 years, became a minister and himself went through, I think, I shouldn't speak about Simon when he's not here, but I think went through more of a conversion than was required of you, Sam, in order to become enthusiastic about how best to deal with the environment challenges and recognise that dealing with climate change could be a major economic opportunity for the UK, not just a cost if we played it right, if we drove that cost curve downwards. I've been asked to speak about how the UK can compete in the net zero age. And can I thank Lindsay and Jack for all their hard work in making this conference happen. As Sam mentioned, I'm freshly become a minister in the new Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. Prior to that, for 5.5 months, the entirety of the energy portfolio policy from all the generation we're trying to engender, the connection challenges, the international net zero work, and indeed every detail of every fringe case of the energy affordability schemes went through my office. So I think I'm probably more delighted than anyone else in the world at the provision of a dedicated energy department with a whole load of ministers to share in the work going forward. And what an exciting prospect we have. Delivering cleaner, greener, and more resilient energy policy is something which hasn't begun with this department, but has in fact been in place for a long time. The UK, as we know, has led the world in climate action. Between 1990 and 2019, we cut our emissions faster than any other major economy in the world, something which perhaps isn't as widely known as it should be. I blame the energy minister myself. Since 2010, you've got to remember then, another key facts for you, but when the Labour government, which is so green and so committed today, when they left power, the electricity, the percentage of electricity that came from renewables was 7%. 7%. It's now heading towards 5%. We've increased renewable energy capacity 6-fold under the Conservatives. In 2012, the legacy from the last Labour government was 40% of our electricity. 40% in 2012 came from coal. By 2021, it was down to 2%. Next year, it will be 0. We made these great strides while nonetheless growing our economy by 76%, nearly doubling it effectively since 1990. And energy security and emissions reduction has been a priority for us for many years. And we should be proud of the fact that as a party that we have put economic prosperity at the heart of our journey to this point. Because if you don't, I go back, when I was first elected, I joined the Environmental Audit Committee, and I went to the COP 2005 at Montreal. And there everyone was having theological discussions about the certainty of the science around climate change. And as a businessman, I just look, who cares? It's a risk, and we should manage it, and we should drive the costs down, especially if we want it not to be a conceit of rich countries, but a genuine global drive. And what could we do in the UK? Then we had a slightly higher share of global emissions, but still passingly small. And those, some voices, fewer, I'm pleased to say, but some voices still today saying, well, we're such a small share of the global emissions, what's the point? Well, the point is, by leaning in ahead of others, which we can do, we have the capability, we're blessed in many ways, we can drive down the cost curve, which is central to meeting this challenge. It's what I came away from that Montreal COP obsessed by. We can drive the cost down, we can develop the technologies and solutions, and we can then export those solutions around the world, sure, to meet net zero, but also to make this country tremendously wealthy. We led the first industrial revolution. The opportunities for us leading the green revolution are really significant. And not just in terms of developing capability here and then exporting it, but actually you look at what we're doing, and you look at our geography, just look at a map of Europe. Who's been blessed with the most phenomenal renewable potential? We have. What can we then do with that? We can convert that into the most competitive, clean energy system in Europe as we go forward into the 2030s. We can convert that into the most competitive green hydrogen, without which you can't decarbonize industry in Europe. And then you need CCUS to complete the industrial decarbonization journey. And we happen to be blessed alongside Norway with more than 80% of Europe's carbon storage. We have a phenomenal opportunity, if we take it, to drive forward the transformation of our economy, not only to develop our energy solutions and then export them, but probably the dynamic impact of delivering that most competitive energy system in Europe in terms of the reindustrialization of the kind of areas where this work is typically concentrated, the Northwest, the Northeast, Scotland, Wales, exactly the areas that we have promised to help level up, to bring back hope and prosperity, to make sure they feel part of the overall picture. I'm very, very excited about the work we're doing, and I see it as not only about delivering on net zero and our climate commitments, but actually it's a huge opportunity for us to regenerate our economy and, as I would hope and expect, come out of the 2030s as the dominant economic power in Europe, with all the positives that brings from the fact that our history and our values and our approach to things is one from which everyone can benefit. But as I say, going forward, we need to build on the progress we've made and to be ambitious for a cleaner, greener, and more prosperous future. And we will do that by achieving various priorities, ensuring security of supply, energy supply this winter, next winter, and in the longer term. And we can be proud of the fact that our system through this winter has proved resilient. We have the second highest LNG facilities within Europe. We have a diverse energy supply with the North Sea basin still producing oil and gas. We're net importers, but I think the North Sea has a serious role to play for years to come. I don't see, just to deal with a topical issue, I don't see new oil and gas licenses in that mature and declining basin as being against our net zero commitments. On the contrary, we are driving the greening of that production, with the industry voluntarily committing to a 50% reduction in emissions from production by 2030. And the idea that it's morally superior while we are burning gas, and we will be burning, even in 2050, about 25% of the gas we burn today, the idea that if we import it with higher emissions, much higher emissions attached to those imports, not from Norway, but from the LNG, which is the more optional element, that is somehow morally superior than producing our own, is environmentally nonsensical. It goes against the financial interests of the United Kingdom, and it risks major oil companies, BP, Shell, and other players, removing their balance sheets, their interest, their engineering capability, their subsea capability, exactly the facilities and capabilities we need to harness in order to deliver hydrogen, carbon capture, and the like. So we, on the Conservative side, while doing more than any previous government, in fact, any other government in the world, I would suggest, are nonetheless doing so in a way which I think appeals to common sense and delivers prosperity in a sustainable way. So we're going to ensure security of energy supply this winter, next winter, in the longer term. We're going to seize the economic opportunities of net zero, which we've talked about. So I was at a meeting this morning of the Offshore Wind Acceleration Task Force, very much focused on how we carry on the remarkable development of offshore wind in this country. I've seen it happening off the coast of Beverley and Holderness, but also growing the UK supply chain, making sure that we build the industrial heft, which goes along with being such a world leader. And, of course, we will also support the government's aim of halving inflation by the end of this year. Now, some people ask whether we can achieve both energy security and net zero by 2050. Can we ensure that we have the reserves we need to geopolitical events such as the war in Ukraine and be selective about the sources of that energy? These are important questions, but it's my firm belief that the answer to both of them is a resounding yes. In 2020, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published estimates of the world's carbon budget. That's the amount of carbon that we can emit while achieving the targets that we agreed at Paris. To have a 66% chance of limiting temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels, it's estimated that if we continue on current trends, we'll have exhausted that budget by as soon as 2046. Even if we limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, the IPCC estimates that 1.7 billion people could experience more severe heat waves. And yes, that was 1.7 billion people. And coral reefs could decline by as much as 99%. So it's not a question of if we can achieve net zero alongside making our energy supplies more secure and our economy more prosperous. It's a question of when we achieve that. I don't think these things are in tension there. The idea that the economy is over here and the environment is over here is one that I know that Sen entirely rejects. One is entirely entangled with the other. They go together, and one without the other makes no sense. Work towards meeting these goals is already underway, and at the heart of this is the government's ambitious British energy security strategy, which we published in April last year, and we will be following up with an energy security plan shortly. By following that, we will produce up to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. We will double our ambition for hydrogen production. We've moved it from 5 gigawatts by 2030 to 10, and grow our solar capacity 5-fold by 2035. And building on those important commitments, the Energy Bill will provide the legislative framework to deliver a cleaner, more affordable, and more secure energy system in the long term. And that bill is currently at the report stage in the House of Lords and will be moving to the Commons shortly. It'll catalyse investment, boost jobs, and unlock new industries to make the UK and continue to be a world-leading low-carbon economy. Now, if we want to realise our ambition for the UK to lead the world in climate action, then carbon capture, usage and storage, as I've said, and hydrogen must be priorities. And the bill will introduce world-leading business models for both of these areas and attract private investment to these sectors by providing long-term revenue certainty for business. And although we won't match the crude attractions of IRA, as I prefer to call the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act from the US, nonetheless, it's great that the US has woken up to this action, that they are unleashing investment in the United States. But I believe that our approach and the fact that we have had, if you look at the investment overall in renewables, I think it's more than 120 billion over the last 10 years or so. So in scale, for an economy that's a fifth the size, I think we're already doing a lot, and we can be confident in our approach going forward. We know that in order to maintain the coalition, of which Sen is an important part going forward, we have to deliver high-skilled, high-paid jobs in our communities. And I believe the Energy Bill will help facilitate just that. 12,000 jobs across the hydrogen value chain, 50,000 jobs potentially in carbon capture, usage and storage, and I believe opportunities will abound for people to better themselves and the planet. And in order to make sure we get our skills strategy right, because one of our biggest challenges is to do the training and skills preparation that we need, we are working across government and with industry through the Green Jobs Delivery Group. And all this demonstrates that net zero is a goal not only to be achieved to protect the world and make us more electable at election time, but in order to drive those economic benefits. My constituency is on the east coast of Yorkshire. I say I've seen the transformation of wind. I remember, having been around sufficiently long, I watched us look to move wind from onshore to offshore. I wondered, going back to my early insight into the main priority being to drive the cost down, whether that would work. Could we truly drive down the cost by going into the inhospitable domain of the North Sea? But what a tremendous job we did through the contracts for difference brought in by this government. We saw £120 a megawatt hour in the first auction drop by about half to the second in 2017, and by just the third in 2019 had come down to £39.50 from £120. So and that model and that approach has been copied by people all around the world. As I say, SEN has been at the heart of an awful lot of the development of thinking within Parliament, within the Conservative Party, and going forward we should be proud and perhaps do a better job of telling the story about what we've done to date on things like energy efficiency. There was, I think, just 14% of homes in 2010 had EPC C or above. That's the kind of benchmark level of energy efficiency you want to see in a home. Now it's approaching half, and we've set up the Energy Efficiency Task Force. We announced last week that Alison Rose, the Chief Executive of NatWest, will co-chair that with my colleague Lord Callanan. And in addition to the £6.5 billion that we're spending in this Parliament, we are, the Chancellor announced in the autumn statement another £6 billion between 2025 and 2028. So we really are leading a transformation, and we're doing it in a way which, far from coming at a cost, it's not free, but the opportunity for us by leaning in ahead, by attracting that private investment, by having the best regulatory frameworks, and I think we probably do, is that we can harness, in answer to Sam's challenge in his opening remarks, we can harness enormous private sector investment as we have done, and going forward, we will not only deliver on our climate goals, we will also deliver sustainable competitive advantage economically for the UK as well. So that's enough from me, and I'm happy to open up to questions from the floor. Start with the gentleman there, just in front of you on your left.
Thank you very much. Joe Dutton from Axis Insurance. People won't have heard of us probably, but we're the world's largest renewable energy insurer. I've got a question on details. Each time the renewables targets for the UK have been upped in the last couple of years, the accompanying document with them has got shorter in length, and the details on delivery have got less and less. But from a development perspective, what we're facing is that last year only 2 wind turbines were commissioned in England. Not projects, just wind turbines, 2. Last month, a battery storage developer was quoted 13 years for a grid connection. And with offshore wind, currently, it's quicker to build the project than it is to get it permitted in the inhospitable North Sea. So, in concrete terms, what's going to change readily, quickly, so that we meet the targets for 2030 and 2035 for the electricity system?
Thank you. Excellent question. I think possibly the biggest challenge is not all the deployment of all these fascinating generations, fascinating as they are, is probably not the biggest challenge. We need to make sure that we have the infrastructure to do it. We will shortly be coming out with a consultation on the national policy statements affecting all these areas. We are, as the Offshore Wind Acceleration Task Force is very much focused on how we shorten, how we halve, ideally, the permitting time it takes. And we've seen Ofgem, the regulator, moving from a kind of reactive approach to allowing anticipatory investment and supporting much greater investment in the grid. So we have to deliver the grid changes, which are significant. The National Grid suggests they need to invest 6.5 times more in the next 7 years than they have in the last 30. And that's not only a huge supply chain, financial deployment challenge, but also an enormous political challenge because it needs real infrastructure landing in constituencies, typically held by Conservatives as well. And we have both to tell the story and show that we're doing everything possible to minimize unnecessary infrastructure that goes there. So there's a lot to do, but you're absolutely right, it's one of the challenges. Last year's auction, allocation round 4, because COVID got in the way, but we had last year, saw the biggest ever level of renewables come, more than 7 gigawatts of offshore wind in AR4, and we're now moving to annual auctions. So this year's AR5 will be the beginning of annual auction rounds. So notwithstanding the challenges, which, as you laid out, are entirely real, we are nonetheless through that thicket delivering now, but we need demonstrably to improve the system and ensure join up across regulators, across government overall, to make sure that we can meet those challenges. Sorry, too long an answer, but right, the lady here.
Hiya, I'm Helena Horton from The Guardian. So today we've learned that energy bills are about to soar, and that is linked to gas prices. Sen MPs have been critical of the amount of time it's taken to do things like install heat pumps and insulate homes. They've also criticised the onshore wind ban. Do you take responsibility as your government for the fact that we have not moved fast enough on these issues and that therefore bills will rise? And will you apologise to those who are struggling to pay their bills?
Well, I'm pleased to say that the government has taken unprecedented intervention this winter. Right now, the government is paying more than half of families' bills through this winter. That's the kind of scale of intervention that we've done. And I've already given the numbers on energy efficiency, which have been transformational since the rather dire position that we inherited, both on renewables and energy efficiencies under Labour. But that's exactly why it's so good to have Sen members of Parliament, because they push the government to go further. They say we need to be more ambitious still. But we have been resilient through this winter thanks to our diverse energy supplies, and I'm pleased to say that going forward we're continuing support both for households and for businesses as we go through the next year. And we engage regularly, obviously, with our colleagues across government, not least in Treasury, to ensure that we have a really clear understanding of those needs and that we have a good system going forward. But we can be proud as a government of what we've done to go and support people and maintain businesses through what has been an extraordinarily challenging time. Yes, the gentleman there with the anorak one and the beard.
Thank you. My name's Paul Haslam. I'm a county councillor from North Yorkshire. So thank you very much for your presentation. I've come all the way to see you today. I'd like to just echo the point about DNOs. We've got projects that are being held up because the grid can't take them till 2034. So I really would like to encourage you to nudge that rather hard, please. Actually, my question, though, to you is, we worry about the sun not being out, and we worry about the fact that the wind's not blowing. But why don't we use tidal? The moon, I believe, is only moving away from the world, from the Earth, at 1 metre a year. So it's going to have a gravitational effect for some time. So I just wondered if we might consider tidal as part of the mix. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. As I said, I agree with you on grid. Possibly it's the biggest challenge facing the department. That's one more reason why I'm delighted we've got a set of ministers and be able absolutely to focus on that and ensure that we pull it all together so we can speed those connections up. On tidal, I'm pleased to say AR4 last year, it was the first time we had tidal successful in those auctions, and the largest tidal generation in the world, first, second and third probably, are in the UK, and following AR4 last year, we're expecting I think another 50 megawatts to come forward through that, and you'll need to watch this space for announcements around the AR5 and the parameters that are there. But I've, from seeing the site where an innovative tidal turbine went at Strangford Lock in Northern Ireland, to I look forward to going up to Orkney and seeing what's going on up there as well. But I think tidal has got a part to play. Thank you. Right, gentleman there.
Hi, thank you. Stephen Alton from Field Consulting. You talked about how there's now more energy ministers dedicated to energy and net zero, but the theory with BEIS was that to reach net zero, we had to have policy levers over business. But now with a standalone department, do you think you have enough policy levers alone to achieve net zero, or do you think there need to be more cross-departmental working?
Good question. Do we need more cross? We always do. I mean, I enjoy convening ministers together and making sure that we don't just sit in our silos, but it's a constant challenge. Anyone stands up and says we're a joined-up government, we're here to help. You've always got to scoff a little. But we do work very hard on it, and that's one of the reasons for having the national policy statements, which, as I say, we'll shortly consult on, because they set out to inspectors in planning and others the priorities, and they give guidance to it. So, but we always need to work away at it. There was no perfect structure of government, but where it was without a dedicated energy department, given how central it is to meeting our environmental and economic goals, the Prime Minister, when he appointed me, said, I really want to set up a dedicated energy department, but he wasn't sure it was the right time then. I feared it might not happen this side of an election, but it did, and I think it was the right thing to do. Yes, gentleman there.
Hello, Councillor Ian Courts. I'm leader of Solihull Council, but I'm also responsible in the West Midlands for Environment Energy in Andy Street's team. We've seen tremendous growth in the last few years under Andy Street's leadership in carbon, decarbonisation and low carbon industries. But we also have quite a lot of heavy industries, heavily dependent on energy, which we're dependent on as a country to ensure they're going. So my question is about support for them. But just secondly, we're really great at inventing things, at innovation, at all that sort of thing. But sometimes commercialism is not the forte in the UK. How are we going to capture some of this new tech for UK industry?
Well, thank you very much for that, Ian. You will hear a lot in the not too distant future. There's a lot coming out from government. We're responding to the Committee on Climate Change report last year, which we delayed to take into account our ability to respond at the same time to the Chris Skidmore review. We will be coming out with a green finance strategy. We have a whole series of a plethora of publications and announcements coming out in the coming weeks. I touched on carbon capture and hydrogen. They're absolutely the decarbonisation of heavy industry relies very much, certain parts of those things cannot be decarbonised without that, and therefore there's a real opportunity for us. We're in a world-leading position. As I say, we're blessed with geography and geology, and you can expect to hear from us soon, as well as we also have a series of pots to support and encourage investment in greening of industry. In terms of scaling up, which in a sense, on your point, yeah, it's a frustration to me that so much of the brilliant R&D that we do in this country seems to turn into $1 billion business somewhere else. And if I had beneath the general target of delivering all this stuff, overall just in terms of deployment, my passion would be trying to develop the UK supply chain and look at how do we build more world-class and serious-sized businesses here. I'm scarred by going when we had more offshore wind than the rest of the world combined, and I was a trade minister. And I met the president of Taiwan, President Tsai, on behalf of our cabinet. No one apart from a trade minister is pretty much allowed to go, so that was probably why they rolled out the red carpet for me. But I was there. We had more than offshore wind than the rest of the world combined. I went to, well, here is the major UK developer. Nope, we didn't really have one. Here's the major OEM from the UK. Nope. So if I carry one thing as a job just determined as we go about through these transformations that we develop, we identify, and that's what things like the Offshore Wind Acceleration Task Force, a number of other bodies that I work with and sit on, is trying to look at how do we create the conditions that make it more likely that those businesses can grow, can play a real role in helping the world meet these challenges, but does so in a way which gives industrial heft to the UK. So I share your frustration, and any ideas gratefully received, and we try and make sure we work across government to make it as attractive as possible to invest here and scale up. This gentleman in the middle there. Then I must come to this side.
Hi, my name is Michael Ware. I work for Green Draft, an international investor and developer. When we look at the UK, we assume at least 2 years, maybe £500,000 to £1 million to develop a project through planning. Could you comment on how that can change? Because that is the biggest impediment, as we see it, to investing in the UK.
Thank you. Well, that's what we hear again and again, so you're absolutely right, sir. Streamlining and building capacity. We've had a system, like Ofgem regulated the connections system, and it was a very reactive one rather than looking ahead. Likewise, we had regulators who were funded in a way which ran behind demand. We need to move a system if we can have developers contributing, if we can have the sort of developers pay principle, we can then move to have it making sure that all the regulators, and if you look at the North Sea, there's a plethora of them, that they have the capacity to respond quickly. So if you take something like, any of the projects you want to think of, what developers need is to be able to have an early conversation and have the questions put to them then, so that when they come back, they've already answered the questions they're going to get put, rather than finding that the regulators don't have the capacity to talk to them, and they say, well, come do a load of work, spend a load of money, and then we'll tell you where you're going wrong and make you go off and do it again, leading to this sclerotic system. So we are looking to streamline and build capacity, and we found additional funding from government initially for that, but we're also changing the system because it needs to be more responsive. Otherwise, as you say, though we may find ourselves uncompetitive, and we don't want that. The lady on the front row here, please.
Sarah Winterton. I represent the UK insulation manufacturers in the UK, including Knauf, Rockwool, Superglass, etc. And I'm also the chairman of the Energy Infrastructure Group, Energy Efficiency Infrastructure Group, always a mouthful, obviously sponsoring the event. Moving back to energy efficiency, the heating and powering of our 29 million homes accounts for 20% of our carbon emissions and uses 35% of our energy. However, 65% of those homes are the owner-occupied homes, are homeowners, and programmes to actually support this tenure have completely bottomed out. There isn't the support for this area, and as a result, the industry that actually services these homes has completely collapsed. How do we actually address this sort of Grand Canyon of a gap in energy efficiency? But also, as an industry, can we please work with you? We have some really terrific ideas, including an energy efficiency stamp duty.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sarah, for that. It's my favourite. The best form of energy is energy you don't use. It's the cheapest, and it's the warmest. So that's why we've set up the Energy Efficiency Task Force, precisely to look at that, and as I say, co-chaired by Lord Callanan and Alison Rose, and it's set up precisely in order to work with industry and make sure that the right voices are heard and that we get policy right to ensure that we have that we're able to make sure that the 65% owner-occupiers, as well as those who are social tenants, etc., are supported on this journey, incentivised. I mean, we've had a history of different approaches through time. I say when you look at the big picture, actually the government, from where we were, has done a lot, but perhaps going forward it's going to be tougher still, and that's why it's so important to get the policies right and to listen to the voice of industry in doing it. Right? Should we allow one more, or you need to crack on?
No, we're okay.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Sorry, I'm about to go and I've got to go and co-chair a session with the US Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm. So we're working closely with them as well. So we're trying to work internationally as well as domestically. But anyway, thank you all very much for hosting me, and I better go.